In this section, we're going to be leveraging the functions that are most likely to be used in our common workdays. We're going to be integrating them with a Northwind database, some tables that are available readily for us, and analyzing how we can generate more data that is useful for our day-to-day analysis. That said, let's go take a look in our demo. Let's start ahead by starting Excel. As usual, we will open a blank workbook. We will seek the connection to Northwind Access Database. That should be in your local folder for the downloads. We're browsing it, and we see the folder for this module. We test the connection and click OK. We're going to be focusing on the order details and related tables. So we select the related tables, click the button, and click Finish. We have successfully imported them into our data model. We can see that readily available right now. So let's go ahead and head into the calculation area of our Power Pivot window. We're going to create a calculated field named Count Valid Shipper ID. What we're attempting here is to utilize the CountA function to count how many shippers' IDs we have currently available. We have to indicate correctly our tables. It is not available here, so what we're going to do is we're going to move into the orders table and continue the process. So once again, we start typing in shipper ID, count A, and we indicate the shipper ID, which is located here after we scroll down. Notice that we get a value. At least we don't get an error. I'm going to expand this a little bit further, and we're getting 43, which is the number of records that are valid. Let's take a look and see how many are available. It sounds about right there. So let's go and add another column, another calculated field. What we're attempting to do is validate how many orders are actually truly filled with a shipper ID. Why? Because if they're missing data, we're going to have some problems down the road. So we want to determine which are the valid records, valid orders, against the total count of orders themselves. For that, we're going to continue creating another calculated field, and we're going to call it orders count. We're going to use this time the count function, and we're going to base it on the order ID this time. Notice that it's telling us that there are 48 orders versus 43 valid ones that are valid shipper IDs. That means that there are 5 different ones that are not meeting our needs, that don't have some data, the shipper ID in particular. Let's try to narrow this down by creating another calculated field and add invalid shipper ID. We're going to leverage another function called countBlank. As you already guessed, it counts blank values in our table. And it does confirm that we have 5 records that are not meeting our shipper ID standards. Great. Now, just to make sure that we are on the right track, let's move into another column and create another calculated field. Call it orders row count. We're going to count the rows just to make sure we're not completely off here. And we're going to expand the column here. This matches the orders count that we use with a different function, count and count rows. Depending on how you're using, they will return similar values, if not the same. You also probably notice that we're using more the calculation area in the Power Pivot window. Why? Well, notice that if we shift back to the workbook, we are adding these automatically here instead of having to go back and forth. That is an easy way of creating your calculated fields within your pivot window, Power Pivot window, and not having to shift back and forth, allowing you to also create calculated columns at the same time. Now, we want to go and check it once more. We're going to continue in the process of validating if this is the right path that we're heading down. We're discovering that we have some missing values in the shipper ID. We're not going to proceed to identify them, but we're going to make a few other counts to determine if we're on the right path. We're going to create a few more calculated fields. This one's going to be called orders with valid shipper ID. And we're going to use another function called countX. This one requires the orders table as a parameter and an expression. In this case, this column. We're going to expand to see what the value retrieved was. This matches exactly what we were looking for when we were counting the values here. So notice this new function countX, what's the use of it? Let's look. It takes a table and expression. All those functions that have an X are a little bit more advanced, give you more power versus the usual functions that we have readily available. We're going to also attempt to discover if we can track down how many unique orders we have. For that, we're going to need the assistance of another function that will help us count and determine if we have any distinct count orders themselves that we can distinguish from the others. That's where distinct count comes in. We're going to specify the order ID for this one, and this matches our order row count. So we're on track. We are making good progress. Next, let's go ahead and determine from our ship dates, since we already know that we have 5 records that are not properly entered, we can do that process by going up here. While this is a small set of data, we can try to pinpoint them down. We're seeing that we have 5 records that have an invalid shipper ID. I'm seeing already 1, 2, scroll down furthermore, 3, 4, and 5. So we are getting valuable data here. We are truly getting good data. Now we're going to find out what was the latest shipping date that we had, order date actually. We're going to create a calculated field named max order date. We're going to use the max function. We're going to apply it at the order date. What this is going to tell us is what was the latest date that we used for an order. And it's telling us that the last one was June 23rd, 2006. Now let's determine which was the earliest order we had. And for this, we're going to use the min. Like the previous function, we're going to use order date. Notice it's telling us that the earliest order we had was January 15, 2006. Now, what we want to do is find a sum of the orders of all our quantities here, what we have sold in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to leverage a function here called row. We're going to create a calculated field, and we're going to indicate its parameters right here. The parameters are going to call it sales, and the expressions are going to be the sum of order details, the quantity in particular. So we're referencing another table. We're going to see how that works for us. Notice one thing. We are located on the orders table, not on order details. What this function does is allow us to retrieve values and utilize other functions nested within itself. So we're calling this, whenever we add it as a pivot table, sales, and it's summing the quantities in order details. That said, let's switch to the workbook. You'll notice that all this is grayed out. So we can click in any area or click escape. We're going to switch back to the workbook. And we're going to insert a pivot table using our current connection and in a new worksheet. I'm going to call this orders. I'm going to collapse all of these. If memory serves correct, we should have the majority, if not all, of our calculated fields here. So let's start adding them and see what happens. The first one, this one seems to be quite of interest. Notice that we have the exact sum that we're asking for. We also had the minimum date, the max, the distinct count, the orders with valid ID, rows count, and we're just using them in general, clicking and showing them here. Notice that these functions, we targeted finding inaccurate data. That could be one possible use. There are many other uses that I'm sure you could leverage and find that might be a better use for you. But the important part is you can get data from data. Let's take a look at what we would require to build the top selling products from our order details table. Let's head back into Power Pivot Manage window, and now let's head into the order details. Notice that we already typed in the top selling products. The formula is not that complex, but does require some explanation. Notice that we're using the SUMX function. Also, we're nesting it with top n. Top n takes the top values that you want to summarize in there to list as your top values. We're telling in this case 10. We're also indicated the table that's going to contain those sales. In this case, order details. We're also indicating the value where it's going to be pulling it from. Notice that it's order details quantity. And in the end, we're entering the quantity parameter into SUMX. That's giving us the total of these values in here, the top selling products. To confirm that we're not off track with these numbers, let's go and head back into the workbook, in which I've created two worksheets that can illustrate our numbers here. I've taken manually the values in here, and notice that these are the top selling products, the top 10. So if we are to match this number, we should be able to tell it to give us the sum of order details quantity, and it matches. Notice it matches. We can even format it. We can add a little comma here and reduce decimals, and we're good. It matches exactly. One thing to really exacerbate here is you have to verify your data. Some other means. In this case, I just copied it into my workbook. I went into Northwind Access Database, entered a query, and pulled it, and then put it inside of Excel itself. There's multiple ways you can use to cross-check your data itself. This is one. Now let's talk about the generate function. The generate function is not easily displayed, and that's why we didn't create a calculated field nor a calculated column. It creates a Cartesian of whichever two tables you indicate. In this case, what we did is we went and took two tables, order details and orders. These two, we created a Cartesian. And what it does is pretty much mix and match them together into one single table. this was the output. Of course, if you try that in a calculated field or a calculated column, you're going to get an error. Why? Because it's not a scalar value, a single value. This gives you an idea how you can use it. So your question probably is, well, if it creates all this amount of data, how can I really leverage it? That's a great question. Well, by creating a Cartesian, there might be a mix and match between orders and order details, and you might want to create sums from that data. As we've seen before, we've used SumX. You could also use filter. By nesting other functions together, you can really summarize and get values from multiple functions, tables, and related tables at the same time. Keep that in mind.